Ex Nihilo. Talking to Dear Mark Lilla, we look forward to today's conversation discussing your new book, Ignorance and Bliss, while examining the zeitgeist, which, as Hegel would have found astonishing, seems to seek happiness in its self prescribed ignorance. But first, tell us, what prompted you to deal with this topic that, to your astonishment, represents a blank space in the history of philosophy and science, and which, because of that, requires a psychologist? So, what made you write this book?
Well, I think ultimately there's a personal story behind it.
Ah,
When I was 13 years old, I became a Jesus freak, which in the 1970s meant that um, one way of getting through the 70s was to grow your hair long, to have a Bible,
yeah, yeah.
have a leather cross around my neck, and bothering all my teachers and fellow students in high school, and essentially just reading the Bible. And I became part of a very close knit religious community for 7 years. And
Oh,
essentially,
that's long.
the only book I read during those 7 years was the Bible. That was my education, which means I missed much of my education. Um, and then I experienced a deconversion.
Hmm?
And I think a lot of my writing has been about people who are struggling with the advantages and disadvantages of knowledge for life.
Hmm.
And for me, uh, what happened is in reflecting on that experience of conversion and deconversion, I realized at some point that in thinking about my own development, finding one thing true, then another thing true, and then a third thing true, um, that I was not asking myself the second half of the question or looking at the second part of the experience, not what I was searching for, but what I was avoiding. That every one of those leaps from one state of mind or uh, outlook or set of presuppositions, in every transition, I had to ask myself, was I seeking the truth or was I somehow trying to avoid certain things? And I won't give you the whole entire psychoanalysis of all those moves and why that happened. I'd have to lay down. But it's an intimate question. It became an intimate question for me.
Ah,
The question of uh, how we, in a sense, uh, with our curiosity and our will to ignorance, have a
mm,
kind of an accelerator and a brake in our souls so that we're going forward, but we're also stopping and we're turning to avoid things.
yeah, yeah.
And once I started looking at my own experience that way, I was struck by how absent reflection about this was certainly in the history of modern philosophy.
Yeah, yeah.
There are exceptions. You think of Montaigne, you think of Pascal, you
Mm,
think of
mm,
Kierkegaard, and of course,
mm,
Nietzsche, who thought he was
mm,
the first and last psychologist.
mm,
But all these psychological questions just dropped out and of the tradition and the kind of insight that had accumulated about these psychodynamics that the ancients were familiar with, that I think many religious thinkers, Augustine's the best
yeah.
example, but also a lot of monastic movements, the thinkers there, the Benedictines and so on, thought about these things. I remember that when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I used to go to the philosophy department that had its own little library. And the sign above the door said Department of Philosophy and Psychology. And that library had been established by William James.
Okay.
So James is an example of someone who understood that something was missing, and he did not see a distinction between philosophy
Yeah, yeah.
and psychology. So, in any case, these are the ways in which I came to it.
In a very understandable way, you've dissected the formative figures of forgetting in Western thought, representing the archetypes of a blissful ignorance. You start with the story of Odysseus, then the taboo of what's hidden, before you arrive at the anti intellectualism of St. Paul's, the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Then you highlight the scapegoat's role associated with the Lamb of God, and finish by introducing the topic of nostalgia as a paradise projected into the past. And in the beginning of your book, you note, with the exception of Nietzsche, that very few authors have addressed this question, which is what you were just talking about. Why is this? After all of these questions represent the cornerstones of Occidental thought.
Yeah, no, that's the question. Um, I think that one has to look at the development of modern Western philosophy and
Mhm.
its anti theological um, mission. And uh, what got thrown away with Revelation somehow
Mhm.
was also reflection on the psychodynamics of the soul, which religious thinkers had spent a great deal of time thinking about. And I think that's for two reasons. One is a desire to establish a kind of certainty that would be transferable from thinker to thinker, from one domain to another, from philosophy to the sciences, and so on. And if that's the mission, there's very little place for the instability and unpredictability of the self.
Interesting.
And because the idea is to try to get rid of all that noise in order to make human behavior
Sure.
more predictable and to reduce it as much as possible to very basic things. And so for Hobbes, it's fear and desire, right? And even though other thinkers, around his time, whether before him, Bacon, or his contemporary Descartes, wrote about the psychodynamics of the soul. Spinoza did as well, but they were all tending in this direction to reducing um, to speak in Platonic terms, the soul, the bottom two parts of the soul, the
Yeah.
thumotic part of the soul and the desiring
Mhm.
part of the soul, and to get rid of the thumotic and to simply give a picture of the human soul as being divided between desires and reason, but getting rid of this third reflective, passionate middle part of the soul that is absolutely essential to Platonic philosophy and psychology. And so I think that that's the main impetus there for the forgetting, and which is why some of the people I've mentioned, like Montaigne and Pascal and so on, uh, even to this day are very hard for teachers to fit into their neat little story about the development of modern philosophy because, in fact, they were talking about something that was absent from the other main figures in the story they developed.
Absolutely, you're totally right. So, in antiquity, people talked about that there was like the pneuma, the soul, and the hülle, the matter. But in between, there was the psychikoi, the psychic beings, and all these psychic beings are wonderfully neglected. Often, forgetting is a cultural achievement. It's no coincidence the ancient Greeks spoke of an ars memoria and an ars oblivionis, the art of forgetting. Not being able to forget certainly has its downsides. We know about the idiots savants who are flooded with images and information, but unable to think abstractly. That is, separating the important from the unimportant. The question is, At what point does repression become pathological? Sigmund Freud explained this wonderfully in a short essay on neurosis and psychosis. In a thought experiment, he imagines a young woman madly in love with the sister's husband. The sister dies, and the young woman can finally say, now the coast is clear and the game is afoot. However, for the neurotic, such a thought is out of question because of piety, understandably. But how does the psychotic react? To solve this dilemma, she says, my sister isn't dead at all. Doesn't the technique of reality denial you describe all have a certain point where they slide into the realm of psychosis?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can use that term to talk about individuals, and I leave that to the professionals. Whether you can talk of social psychosis, I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
Mhm.
But I think, I mean, leaving the Freud example aside, one of the things that let me put this in the context of just the um, our new way of having to deal with floods of information,
yeah,
such that life ends
Mhm.
up feeling not like we're sitting on the ground and we can stand here, we can all hier stehe ich, ich kann nicht anders, right? And then
Mhm.
you could also move somewhere else.
mm,
But the idea that we're all now surfing is the metaphor that comes to my mind,
yeah,
that waves of information
yeah,
and new changes keep coming at us and everything is unstable. And one thing I could have talked more about in the book that interests me is the psychology of uncertainty.
oh yeah,
That
Sure.
it's not so much things we want to, I mean, you can tell one story, and I do, about the things we're trying to forget.
mhm,
But on the other hand, there are also things we're trying to read out because there's too much coming at us.
mhm,
And we have, this sense of pride in our ability to understand our environment. It's not
mhm,
just a question of needing to do so in order to reach our own ends. We feel a kind of
Mhm.
pride in being able to do that. And when we cannot, uh, we feel as if we've been somehow belittled and we've
mhm,
lost our sense of worth. And so I return to the story of Thrasymachus and Socrates in the Republic, and also in another dialogue, the theme of, mythology. Uh,
mhm,
Socrates develops this term mythology as an analogy with the term misanthropy. And he says misanthropy is when arises when you've had several bad experiences or number of bad experiences with human beings, and at a certain point, you feel you no longer understand them. You have
mhm,
no idea what they're going to present to you, that your friendships will not last, your love won't last. And so you shut down. Yeah. And so there's a shutting down that goes on because, uh, in part, because you, the only way to um, confirm to yourself your sense of being someone with good judgment and knowledge is to somehow throw the problem over to those with whom you've had relations and decide in the end that the human race is unredeemable. Well, similarly, um, we have experiences with trying to understand. And if we keep trying to understand and fail to understand, a similar
Mhm.
process goes on. And so our sense of ourselves is challenged. And therefore, there's a need to somehow have a simple explanation or a simple way of filtering things out in order to maintain your strong sense of self
mhm,
and pride in yourself. So it's that the psychodynamics for me of pride and shame are the terms in which I discuss this rather than those of psychosis. that you can see how the shutting out of reality could lead to the kind of phenomenon that Freud was talking
Kind of
about.
triaging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do understand it perfectly, I would say. But there's something weird. Like, I would say, following your idea of this liquid modernity, so to speak, with Sigmund Bauman, this free-floating mind that we're in, which makes us really like, feel uncomfortable in many ways, discontent of modernity, you could say. But it's like when people feel kind of terror, they get terrible simplificateur, they get terrible simplifier. So, and that's so in a way like what but there's a beautiful remark, and we talked about it by Nietzsche, who sees himself as a new type of philosopher. And this really struck me very much. He asked the question, who among philosophers was a psychologist before me, and not rather the opposite, a higher swindler, an idealist? There was no psychology before me at all. This is a topic you incorporate into your observations in one way or another, namely that for solving certain problems, it's not philosophy, but psychology which must be used. We could take this even a step further. Could it be that philosophy as a whole still suffers from an intellectual infantilism that's erected mental walls, prevents us from seeing the world? At the beginning of your book, you note that the will to seek the truth, and that's really a wonderful sentence, the will to seek the truth is much weaker than the blessings of ignorance. What if this is the problem of philosophy as such?
Uh, well, there was a lot in there. So what is it? What is the thing, if you were to put it in a short phrase, that you're asking me whether that's the problem of philosophy? I'm asking you.
I think I was always wondering about this American trait of psychology, the separation of the mind and body, etc. And I alluded before in the observation of antiquity that in the antiquity they had the soul and they had the matter, etc. And there was something in between which was the human psyche, the psychikoi. And the Gnostics made a big deal about this being the drama where all this takes place, a battle between like the symbolon, diabolon, etc., between God and devil and the like. So, and this forgetfulness in regard of this psychological thing. So that I would say that's the whole thing about your book. So how is it that we kind of like touch questions which are untouched or seldomly touched before?
Yeah. No, I'll try to answer your question, but I also sympathize with your question, and it's something that uh, I've thought a lot about. Not to any great conclusions, but it does seem to me that the more I read the Platonic dialogues, the more Plato himself believes that psychology is the master science. That the master science is not
Interesting.
it's not ontology, it's not metaphysics. That the moment you have to deal with logos, the moment you have
Yeah,
to deal with human interaction in dialogue, as soon as there's this turn to the human and away from the stars, what are you talking about if you're not talking
yeah,
about psychology?
sure.
And if you look at Socrates's behavior, not his arguments, but his behavior, the action
Mhm.
of the Platonic dialogues, you see what a master psychologist he is. You know, he, in every dialogue, I think one of the reasons there are contradictions among the dialogues
Sure.
is that
Mhm.
Socrates is actually giving his the particular interlocutors,
Yeah.
what they need to hear therapeutically. I mean, they need a certain version of the truth or a partial
Mhm.
truth or something that puts them on the way to truth. But the sorts of interlocutors that he's dealing with in the Phaedrus and the Phaedo are
Yeah.
quite different from those
Absolutely.
in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Sophist, for example, where he's with
Mhm.
his enemies or his adversaries, right?
Mhm.
And so uh, it's hard for me now not to read the Platonic dialogues as works of psychology. Um, and and then it disappears. Even with Aristotle, when you think about it, it really was
Absolutely. Yeah. He's a
it, it,
materialist.
it, it's with the
Mhm.
post-Platonic
Mhm.
sects that you
Mhm.
still, the Stoics and Epicureans, where you still have something, but it's a very truncated psychology, you know? Yeah, but that's as far as I've gotten. But I do think it's a master science. And one thing I do every 2 or 3 years is I teach a seminar on Montaigne's essays,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Which are wonderful.
but also but
Mhm.
from this point of view, yeah, is that in a sense he's understood the Platonic turn. And so the things he has to say about Socrates are very interesting and worth paying attention to.
Yeah, Plato is really kind of committing something like a philosophical theater in a way, which is implying kind of the art of psychology, having all this. I mean, so this is kind of a very, very special thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and what goes along with that is the art of rhetoric. And
yeah, yeah,
so,
sure.
you know,
Sure.
and so it's the rhetorical dimension to all these thinkers that becomes more and more interesting to me.
So if we go to a more recent philosophical history, we find several strange cases of repression. An exemplar would be Gottlieb Frege's essay entitled The Thought, where he asks, what distinguishes using a hammer from the thinking of a thought? His answer is astonishing because he says that unlike the hammer, you don't have a thought in your head, you receive it, making it a bit like Sigma Polker's painting titled Higher Beings Have Commanded. Paint the upper corner of the picture black.
Hmm.
Why does Frege, who's plagiarized Boolean logic, declare philosophy as divine?
Uh, well, that yeah, it's divine in the sense that Plato sometimes would portray the poets as just the
Mhm,
messengers of the gods, right? They're just essentially postal
mhm,
workers that take the letters from
mhm.
above and then, deliver them to the rest of us. But that's a very nice. I don't know that polka painting, but I will, I will.
Which is the triangle, the black up there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, well, it's interesting, and I haven't thought of it. I would have to think through the European languages I have some familiarity with. But certainly in English, it's extraordinary how we use the passive voice to talk about thinking often.
Mhm,
So you say, it occurs to me,
mhm,
right? It's the
Mhm.
passive
Yes.
voice. And or or the thought, yeah, it occurs to me, the thought came to me.
mhm,
um, and so it's not us going out and thinking, I'm now going to think the thought and then think it. Everything comes to us, and so at the bottom of that, uh, there's a mystery. And there are philosophers who've touched on this, Heidegger a little. um, but that the truth of that, what I write about in the book, is that the fact that we all experience revelation every day.
mhm,
In this conversation, ideas are coming to us,
Mhm.
yes.
Of course.
And so it's not a stretch, if that's the case, to think that one might be able to have a special access to truth that does not require evidence, the sorting through of arguments, logic, but that if, on the contrary, we purge ourselves of what we believe to be error and open ourselves more fully to this experience we have every day, that
Mhm.
in fact we will get farther and understand our situation more. Here we want knowledge, but we want knowledge in a kind of pathological way, that because we refuse to have uncertainty,
Exactly.
we then want to open ourselves up and say, no, I'm the truth seeker here, not you, the scientist with your hypotheses, your
Mhm.
test tubes, and all that. I'm the seeker. And the way I seek is I get rid of all of that and I start making the climb up the mystical staircase or the
sure.
ladder or
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. The
epith-
spiral.
epiphanic experience. And so the will to ignorance often manifests itself as a will to knowledge.
I've written several books on the machine's cultural history, philosophy, and psychology, and I've come across a recurring leitmotif. Whenever a new universal machine sees the light of the day, a certain darkness spreads out. This applies to the alphabetic machine, the Weber automaton in the Middle Ages, and even the history of digitalization, which we've projected into the metaphysical heavens when we talk about the curse and blessings of AI, which is religious talk, is it? Thus, I'd say that this blissful ignorance constitutes an attempt to deceive ourselves about a phantasm in the form of a phantom desire, about the feeling of an unbearable loss, a phantom pain. Paraphrasing Freud, you could say that you no longer feel like the master of your own house. Can you make sense of this interpretation?
Well, it certainly makes sense of what I was saying about surfing as, as experience comes
Yeah, yeah.
comes toward us. Um, but yeah, it's very interesting what you're saying. I haven't read the things that you're referring to that you've written, but it would be very interesting to think about as you were saying, I guess the pathos of the experience of a new machine. That on the one hand, feeling that, well, you created it, but now this thing does something for you,
On its own.
right? And so you end up feeling diminished. And so then the question is how you compensate for that
Exactly.
experience of feeling diminished. So let me ask you, I mean, what kind of compensation do you see when these machines arrive and we experience them?
For me, the question was totally simple. So I started asking a very simple question. Has there ever been a thing like the computer before? So it was clear the automaton of the Middle Ages was something like that, a universal machine, which could be a mill. It could be also like even musical notation, like a partiture, etc. But it could be little automatons driving some figures on a cathedral, etc. It could be a mechanical clock, like kind of like driving the whole society, etc. The funny thing now is we assign the history of mechanization to Descartes, 17th century. Okay, so but the mechanical clock is 12th century.
Mm.
So what is it like? Descartes coming 5 centuries later? He's a latecomer. Even in the very moment he appears on the stage, etc., he mistakes the machine and makes it like a divine something, like which is like a conceptio in the sense of the Frege, etc. But he doesn't take the materiality of the something. And you see, like if you go back into the Middle Ages, you could say that a lot like rising proto-capitalism and the like, so the people felt discontent. So all of a sudden they were confronted with something they didn't like, etc. So and all of a sudden, like something like this blissful ignorance took place all over, like self-flagellation, things like we know, so that occupied me very much
I understand. Yeah.
just as a social mechanism. So there's like a phantom pain you lose, which is exactly what we experience today with digitalization. So we know a lot of like functions that we had in our representative world are losing like importance, etc. And all of a sudden we feel deprived, kind of amputated in a way. So we feel like our something lost limbs are still aching, and we get into phantom
It's a very
desires.
good metaphor. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. The paradox that, and here I'm probably just catching up to what you've been thinking
Mm,
and writing about, but um, that on the one hand, with AI, we feel we have this an access to knowledge, which on the one hand might make us feel more powerful, but in another sense is disempowering
absolutely
because
belittling.
it's not us, and also it's a black box. We don't know how it operates, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And and I guess the assumption I've been working with in the book is that when that sort of thing happens, uh, there are a couple things that human beings might psychologically be moved towards. One is to just shut off, to close the windows
Mm.
and the doors and so on. The other is to treat this thing as a kind of genie that
Mhm,
becomes then a source of revelation of
mhm.
sorts, right? Um, uh,
A very simple question. I mean, you have seen the rise of the digital natives like teaching philosophy for a long time. So did you see a change in your students over from the 90s onwards to this very day?
yeah, uh, in a double sense that is related. Um, they become they feel less autonomous in
Ah,
really the Kantian sense of feeling that they can work through a problem themselves.
mhm,
Yeah. And so there's a tendency to want to crowdsource everything.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
right.
The
And
hollow man comes into play.
yeah, and to uh, become much more outer outer
Mm,
directed,
mm,
less of a sense that they can encounter, let's say, an argument in a
mm,
book and can meet the thinker on a
mm,
level playing field. Yeah. Um, and so that's the case. And also, they are certainly less willing to express their views in class. And every teacher says this now, uh,
Really?
because they're hyper aware that it's not just the people in the room
repercussions.
who are there
Mm.
listening
Oh, yeah.
and reacting, but also the people those people are talking
Mm,
to online.
mm,
And so if they say something that's a little politically
mm,
incorrect or is
mm.
interpreted that way, it will go out and there are, they
Oh,
could
yeah.
quite likely be ostracized, right?
Mm,
And so there's less,
Yes.
when they come to talk to me privately, there's a lot of independence of mind. But when they're in a group, there's less independence of mind.
oh, interesting.
Yeah. It's strange how, yes, in the world of social media, all of a sudden you have to be very aware of what you say. Because in terms of how Martin's got the formula of x equals x to the n. Something small scales up into something huge. So somebody takes a comment that you make, and like a rhizome, it's a network that grows. They put the comment out there, somebody clicks on it, somebody else clicks on it, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm,
And pretty soon you're ostracized from society.
yeah.
And nobody's bothered to check whether it's really true or not. It's a very interesting phenomenon. But
What you're talking about is kind of like a digital demons, right? Like all of a sudden, like kind
yes,
of like avatars appear on the scene, etc., and you have to deal with that.
Mm,
It's not only that you can say like me as an individual. All of a sudden, you feel okay. You've got like a hordes, like demons, like this big saying of like these anonymous. We are legion. You have to deal with the legion of demons,
mhm.
like in the Bible. The guy.
And, and
yeah,
and it's even worse because you're not dealing with them directly. You're dealing with them in a
Yeah, yeah,
mediated
horrible.
way through the
yes,
24/7.
person that you're talking to. So,
Yeah, yeah,
so it's even less a predictable situation.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
as an eminent political thinker, you've already grappled with the dilemma of identity politics and its attack on liberalism in your book, The Once and Future Liberal. When reflecting on us as a boomer generation and our experience of the past 50 years, how would you translate this post 68ers history into a grand narrative which would serve as a plausible account for future generations? Or is this simply utterly impossible because of our self imposed ignorance?
Well, it's in the nature of developing any historical narrative uh, that you have to practice the art of forgetting because you have to be selective. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's always seemed to me that uh, to tell a story responsibly is and I wasn't entirely responsible. I think in my book, my last book, um, is that you somehow need to, while tying events together, you need at the same time to capture the sense that at every moment there are tensions, right? You can't just think about, you know, it used to be when I was a student that you taught the history of political thought as, a necessary march from
Mm.
the Enlightenment to
Yeah, yeah.
the French Revolution to the expansion of the revolutionary idea, and you would end with Marx or Nietzsche, and then you had a
Mhm.
nice. And what's read out of that is not just different thinkers, but also the fact that there were tensions at each of these moments. That there were always um, uh, um, sort of adversaries, and that one is engaged with. Uh, I don't know if the name Todd Gitlin will be
No,
what you
who is it?
know. Well, he was for a short time president of the Students for Democratic Society, 1965 and
Okay.
1966, and that was the main student
Yeah, yeah.
organization against the Vietnam War and all the rest. And
Mhm.
he wrote a very good book on the 1960s. And when I finally arrived at Columbia, uh, uh, I was an admirer of his, but I was struck that in his account, there were no conservatives. It was as if they didn't
Ah.
exist back then. And so I challenged him to teach a course where each of us would alternate. He would speak for an hour, and I would speak about all the stuff he left out. Yeah.
That's
Uh,
funny.
but unfortunately, he got sick, and unfortunately, he passed. So one would have to sort of capture that along the way, and also put oneself in the seat of those who actually made decisions, and so understanding not only the constraints they were under, the information they had, and all the rest. So somehow you've got to do that, plus pay attention to these social forces that keep moving. So if I were to do a more responsible job than I did, yeah, in my book about the rise of identity politics, it would also I would also be obliged to look at, um, for instance, say more about identity politics on the right, and the relation between the two of those, that is identity politics on the left and right. I would have to pay more attention to those people in the Democratic Party who were resisting the turn to identity politics early on and were always present in fighting this fight. In a way, I tell the story that until Mark Lilla comes to write about this, no one had revealed that this was going on in the Democratic Party. So yeah, so I would have to do all of that. But is there something particular about uh, the kind of narrative you were asking me about and asking for? Because certainly I would also have to leave certain things out.
Yeah, we had a wonderful talk with Sam Vaknin, which was he's a psychoanalyst, etc. And he had a wonderful saying. He said, "I am a contemporary of Shakespeare. Fair is foul and foul is fair." So this is like, I mean, so we are the boomer generation in a way. So and like there are a lot of stuff when I think back to the 80s, back to the 90s, etc. And look at the time travel now into my contemporary life, etc. I have the feeling this is really weird going on. Like, for example, the return of flagellance, self-flagellation, a lot of stuff. I mean, I dealt a lot with the thinking about the Middle Ages and all this phantom pains and phantom desires, etc. I would say a lot of stuff is kind of reappearing. So in a weird way, So, so that we can say that even like our times have like a little bit more of cognitive dissonances than, for example, like the 80s or the 90s.
Mm.
Or would you like have another opinion in this regard?
Oh no, I think that's completely right, which then raises the question for me of whether back in the 80s when we were all younger, um, whether the environment was such to make it more comprehensible to us. And so it was easier to feel that we understood our situation, and there were fewer phenomena like this. The world had become more explicable to us. Various political myths had disappeared by the time we get to the early 1990s. So either on the one hand, there's been a change in the environment that's caused this, or whether uh, during the period we're talking about, the three of us and people like us were wholly ignorant of some deeper
Hmm.
developments that were going on that, had we been more aware of them, and had more people been, that we would be manifesting these same pathologies that you're talking about. And so perhaps we had simply developed what you call in English a just so story, that
Okay.
story
Mm.
that you wrap it up and it has a bow on it and you say, aha, here's my story of the present, and that we weren't questioning enough, and we weren't skeptical enough of ourselves back then.
For me, it's very simple because, like, I wrote about digitization and like started in the late 80s. My first theoretical text was entitled "Digital Metaphysics," so I really got into the history, and I felt right from this time onwards, so that all my the contemporaries were kind of losing ground in many ways. So that like a new terra incognita appeared. Like Peter Handke once said, like that, like the world turned white again. I would say, like in the 80s, the world turned white again. And all of a sudden, all these new modes of communication appeared. For example, the avatar, the computer games, and the world being connected in a way that all of a sudden, like a remark of mine, would be propagated throughout the networks. So I fully understand Nietzsche's idea that instead of engaging in metaphysical swindling, it's necessary to resort to a form of psychology. Without it, the history of the Occident, which, as philologists say, began with the Greek miracle, would have remained a complete mystery to me. Instead, I would agree with Jacques Lacan, who, remarking that the gods have left the field of the real, suggests our self-inflicted blissful ignorance is a denial of reality, leading to the question, and that's really important, like, because also because of your religious background, what is it that our contemporaries find so unbearable about our present that they must revive ghosts of the past, the apocalypse, the oracles, the sacrificial lamb, and holy simplicity and innocence, all the things that you have carefully dissected, which are all of them are religious.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, I think maybe the thing to start talking about, that it was left out earlier in our conversation, and especially in what I was saying about the forgetfulness of psychology and contemporary philosophy, that what went along with um, the removal of the thumatic element of the soul, so
Mm,
that our picture of ourselves
Mhm.
were rational
Yeah.
creatures with desires,
mm,
is that one thing that was behind the effort to simplify this picture, the picture of the human soul, was in order to achieve mastery. Yeah.
sure.
And so it's not just, we want to be more certain out there, but we want to achieve mastery, right? From Bacon on. And what one paradoxical thing that we're experiencing in the present is that simultaneously, that each little innovation makes us feel as if we have greater mastery over
Absolutely. Yeah.
particular
Mhm.
things.
Mm,
But the sum
Yes.
total of these
mm,
and the constant change of them makes us feel we have less mastery. over ourselves and our environment, because part of mastery of the present is the ability to predict the future. But if you're living in a time of constant innovation and human interaction and thinking through networks and all the rest, the past becomes less and less predictable to us, it seems to us. And so the myth we had of mastery has disappeared.
Absolutely. I would say this moment of mastery and on the other hand, belittlement, you can really bring it down to like just two words. You got in the Renaissance, the emergence of the virtuoso. Like the funny thing is like the virtues of the Middle Ages, like all these Christians, turned into the virtue, which Pico della Mirandola says is the trait of the chameleon. Like human dignity is that he's a chameleon, which is very funny. So we've got the virtuoso appearing, etc. But the virtuoso has a real problem. For example, Nicholas Butler, like this American philosopher, took it beautifully. He said, like, a specialist is someone who knows more and more about less and less until he knows everything about nothing. So we see the specialist getting down, he gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And our moment of mastership in the world of virtuality, where we have all this stuff at hand. So I would say, put it really bluntly, I would say, in the times of virtuality, the virtuoso will not survive. So that's our belittlement. That's our like a deep Freudian humiliation. So we want to be virtuosos, but we aren't anymore. And we really feel belittled and like discontent in modernity just because of that. Because we're empowered, we may be beautified, and on the other hand, like we are totally helpless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thinking about this starts quite early. It so happens I did a seminar on Pascal's Pensées last semester,
Ah, okay.
and Pascal writes about this. He says we face the choice of either knowing a lot about one thing or knowing a little bit about everything, and this is not an easy choice. And he says, in the end, it's better for human beings to know a little about many things. And so, even though he himself was a virtuoso of mathematics and the sciences, I think he was seeing that in the future that would disappear, and that a kind of ability to hover
Mhm.
over things would be an art to learn.
Yeah. You are a science fiction writer, writing a dystopian tale where a new religious leader emerges who weaves together all the loose threads of modernity's discontent into religion. What would that religion look like? Or if you want to take it down a notch by choosing political theology, what would the ideology be?
Well, are you asking what I think a healthy one would be, or what I would predict would, in fact,
Maybe both. Maybe both.
attract followers?
Maybe both.
I guess what I would want to see would be something that would be a kind of Augustinian modesty.
Okay.
That um, somewhere Kafka says, I feel as if I'm the only person who has ever really understood the fall of man. And, uh, you know, one healthy thing that would happen would be for us to have a substitute for, or simply to reconsider the truth of the notion of the fall and our fallenness, leading to a kind of modesty, not a a kind of anti-humanism and
Mm.
self-abnegation, but on the contrary, getting the real measure of ourselves and having a conception of ourselves as fallen. Um, I think is closer to the truth about ourselves than other religious presuppositions about our nature. I mean, though I'm no longer in any sense a theist, I do believe we're fallen, but I just don't believe in original sin.
Mhm.
And so that I think would, um, but it's so against the grain, not only of our sense of modesty, our sense of self, sorry, our sense of mastery and our sense of self, that this kind of Augustinian modesty would, I, I'm not sure how appealing people would find it unless it would be tied to an explanation of why we feel unhappy, right? And that's the power of Augustine's Confessions, is that he doesn't make any
Yeah.
theological claims. It's a prayer to God. He doesn't need to convince God that God exists. Uh, but what he wants to do is persuade the reader that human misery comes from misunderstanding ourselves and uh, overvaluing that paradoxically overvaluing ourselves is precisely the source of our unhappiness. What do I? What kind of religion could I see arising? What kind of religion could I see arising? You know,
You'd like to convert to again, like from
Yes.
decomposition to.
What would
yeah,
what would pull you forward?
what I would predict would be a kind of
Hmm.
Gnosticism,
Oh yeah.
and with a sense that there is an elect on the one hand and that there are demons everywhere on the other, that uh, dealing with the kind of uncertainty that we deal with now, the lack of self knowledge, I could see the appeal of that.